She's a psychology PhD student. He's the heir to East Asia's most notorious gang, and their contract has only one clause: 1 year as his wife in exchange for her younger brother's life. Nyla Mercer thinks she's smart enough to play this game, but inside Kael Arden's glass tower, every hallway is a trap, every kiss a warning, and every woman who's ever stood in her place disappears in different ways. This is the story of the world's most dangerous love. Like and comment the name of the city you're viewing from. Let me know how far my story has come. The call came at 2:47 in the morning, and Nyla knew before she even picked up that something had already broken beyond fixing. She'd been awake anyway. She was always awake at that hour, hunched over her dissertation notes at the kitchen table of her Shibuya apartment, the kind of deep Tokyo quiet pressing against the windows that made a person feel like they were the last one left on Earth. Her coffee had gone cold 2 hours ago. Her highlighter had dried out. She'd been staring at the same paragraph about coercive control theory for 40 minutes without reading a single word, which was its own particular kind of irony given what was about to happen to her life. The number was international, American area code. She recognized the prefix before her brain fully caught up: Chicago, where Marcus lived, where their Aunt Patricia still kept the apartment above the dry cleaners on West 47th that smelled like pressing starch and old arguments. She answered. What she heard on the other end wasn't Marcus. It was a detective named Saito, stationed at a precinct she'd never heard of, speaking English with the careful precision of someone who had delivered this kind of news before and had learned the hard way to keep his voice flat. He told her that her brother Marcus Mercer, 23 years old, graduate of DePaul University, 3 months into a teaching program in the Shimokitazawa neighborhood of Tokyo, had been arrested at the scene of a gang shooting that left 2 men dead and a third in critical condition. He told her Marcus was being held without bail. He told her the evidence was, in his word, substantial. He did not tell her that her brother was innocent, because that wasn't his job, and because at that moment, nobody on the official side of things was particularly interested in that particular possibility. Nyla sat with the phone against her ear for a long moment after Detective Saito finished talking. Outside, a single car moved through the wet street below. Its headlights swept across her ceiling and disappeared. She said, "I'll be there in 20 minutes. She was there in 15. The precinct smelled like cigarette smoke and industrial cleaner, and something underneath both of those things that Nyla had once read was the specific chemical compound released by sustained human stress. Cortisol and adrenaline metabolizing through skin. Fear, essentially. The building smelled like fear. She'd pushed through that smell 100 times in clinical settings, hospitals, intake facilities, the juvenile detention center where she'd done her second year of fieldwork, watching 15-year-olds try to hold their faces together under fluorescent lights. She knew what institutional spaces did to people, how the architecture itself was designed to make you feel small and procedural and removable. Knowing all of that did not make it easier to sit across a scratched table from her baby brother and watch his hand shake. Marcus had always been the steady one, which was the irony that kept catching in her throat. She was the one who'd had panic attacks in high school, who'd picked psychology as a field because she'd needed to understand her own interior chaos before she could function in the world. Marcus had been the one who talked her down from ledges, literal and figurative, who made her laugh at the exact moment when she'd convinced herself there was nothing left to laugh about. He was not laughing now. He sat across from her in a gray detention room, wearing clothes that weren't his left eye swollen half shut, a cut along his jawline that had been cleaned but not stitched. He was trying very hard to appear calm and succeeding only in appearing like someone trying very hard to appear calm, which Nyla recognized because she had taught herself that same performance over years of sitting with people in crisis. "I didn't do this," he said. "I know. Nyla, I need you to actually believe me, not just say it." "I believe you," she said. And she did, completely, without reservation, which was part of what made the next 3 weeks so brutal, because believing someone is innocent and being able to prove it are 2 entirely different categories of problem, and the Japanese legal system was not particularly interested in her certainty. She sat with him for 40 minutes before a corrections officer came to end the visit. She spent the rest of that night and the entirety of the following morning on the phone with every legal contact she had, every professor from her program who might know someone, every embassy resource she could locate. By noon, she had spoken to 4 lawyers, two of whom told her flatly that the evidence against Marcus was too strong for them to take the case, one of whom quoted her a retainer fee that was more than her annual stipend, and one of whom spoke to her for 20 minutes with apparent sympathy before stopping returning her calls entirely. The American embassy was polite, professionally, bureaucratically polite, in a way that communicated very clearly that politeness was the full extent of what they were offering. She went back to her apartment, sat on the floor with her back against the couch, and allowed herself exactly 7 minutes of falling apart, crying hard enough that her chest hurt, fists pressed against her eyes, breathing gone ragged and useless. She'd learned years ago that 7 minutes was about the length of time her body needed to metabolize acute grief before it could begin functioning again. She'd never tested the theory under these conditions before. After 7 minutes, she stood up, washed her face, and started making a different kind of list. 3 weeks later, she was out of money, out of options, and out of the kind of hope that feels productive rather than delusional. The lawyer she'd finally managed to hire, a mid-tier defense attorney named Tanaka, who had been recommended by a colleague at her university, had reviewed the prosecution's evidence and delivered his assessment with the sympathetic but unbothered efficiency of a man who had learned not to get emotionally involved in cases he didn't expect to win. The security footage placed Marcus at the scene. His fingerprints were on a weapon recovered nearby. 2 witnesses had independently identified him. The actual shooters, members of a low-level gang operation whose territory included that particular corner of Shimokitazawa, had either disappeared or were refusing to talk. "The witnesses are lying," Nyla said. "Probably," Tanaka agreed. "Proving that is another matter. Someone set him up. Also probably." He straightened his papers. "Miss Mercer, I want to be honest with you about the trajectory of this case." She didn't want him to be honest with her about the trajectory of this case. She let him do it anyway, because honesty, however brutal, was more useful than comfortable lies. He told her that Marcus was likely looking at a minimum of 8 years, more realistically 12, in a Japanese correctional facility, beginning in approximately 4 months when the trial concluded. She thanked him. She left his office. She stood outside on the Shinjuku sidewalk in the gray November cold, people pushing past her in both directions, and she felt something she didn't have a clinical name for. It wasn't despair exactly. It was closer to the particular stillness that comes when every available door has closed and the room has gotten very small. That was when her phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. "I know about your brother. I know what actually happened that night. More importantly, I have the resources to do something about it. If you want to talk, come to Okubo Tower, 41st floor, tomorrow at 7 p.m. Tell no one Shawl, K.A." She stared at the message for a long time. Every clinical instinct she had said, "This is a predator. This is someone who has identified a vulnerable person at their lowest point and is offering what appears to be rescue, which is the oldest setup in every category of exploitation, from romance fraud to trafficking. The anonymous contact, the secrecy instruction, the dangling of hope. It was a textbook approach, and she had written papers that cited it. She went anyway. She went because Marcus was 23 years old and had never hurt anyone in his life, and because she was out of other options, and because the alternative was watching her brother disappear into a system that had already decided what he was, and she had decided years ago that she would burn down any door that stood between her and the people she loved. She went. But she spent the entire cab ride to Okubo Tower cataloging exit strategies. The 41st floor of Okubo Tower was not what she expected, which itself was its own kind of strategy, she understood later. She'd expected something deliberately intimidating, chrome and darkness, and the aggressive minimalism of people who wanted you to feel their power through negative space. What she walked into instead was a room that felt almost inhabited. Books on actual shelves, not decorative spines, but read books, cracked spines. Some of them stacked sideways because whoever owned them had run out of room and hadn't cared. A long window overlooking the city that turned Tokyo into something like a living thing, breathing light in every direction. 2 chairs and a low table, 1 glass of water already poured. Kael Arden was standing at the window with his back to her. He was younger than she'd imagined. That was the first thing that registered. She'd built a mental image of power as age, the way crime narratives usually assembled themselves. The gray-haired patriarch with his rings and his history. Kael was maybe 30, possibly younger, with the kind of physical composure that some people are born with and others spend years and significant violence acquiring. He turned when she entered, and she made herself hold the eye contact because she had learned long ago that the first moment of eye contact with a difficult person was either a concession or an establishment, and she wasn't in the business of conceding. He said, "You came alone. You said to." Most people don't listen. Most people don't have as much to lose as I do. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, more like a brief acknowledgement of something unexpected. He gestured toward the chairs. She sat. He didn't, immediately. He poured a second glass of water and set it in front of her, which she noted. The positioning of the pour before she sat meant he'd anticipated she would take that chair, which meant he'd been watching her movement from the moment she entered the room, even while appearing to look at the city. Nyla Mercer, Kael said. 23. Teaching English in Shimokitazawa. Wrong place, absolutely wrong time. The shooting was a territorial dispute between two operations that had nothing to do with your brother. He witnessed something he shouldn't have, and the easier solution for the people involved was to make him the suspect rather than the witness. I know all of that, Nyla said. What I don't have is proof. I have proof. She let that sit for a moment. Why? Why do I have it, or why am I offering it? Both. He sat down finally, and she noticed that even sitting, he occupied space differently than most people. Not the aggressive sprawl of men trying to dominate a room, but a kind of concentrated stillness, like something that didn't need to announce itself because it already knew exactly what it was. I have it because my organization has significant interests in the Shimokitazawa area, and monitoring those operations is standard practice. I'm offering it because I want something. What? It wasn't a question. She dropped the inflection deliberately, because questions gave the other person control of the tempo, and she wasn't willing to do that yet. I need a wife, Kael said. The silence that followed was substantial. Nyla held it, let it breathe, watched his face for the tell that this was a joke or a test or a metaphor, and found none of those things. You're serious. 1 year, legal marriage on paper, functional marriage in public. Events, appearances, interactions with my father's associates and our business partners. In exchange, the evidence goes to the right people, the witnesses recant, and your brother is home inside 72 hours. Why me? I have my reasons. That's not an answer. It's the answer you're getting tonight. He leaned forward slightly, just slightly, elbows on his knees, and she felt the recalibration of pressure in the room, the way you feel a change in elevation, not pain, but the awareness of a different kind of weight. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to make a transaction. You're a psychologist. You understand the difference between trust and a calculated exchange of value. She did understand that. She understood it clearly enough to know that she was sitting across from someone who had done more research on her than a stranger at a business meeting had any reason to do. You know what I study, she said. I know quite a bit about you. How? That's also not a question I'm answering tonight. Nyla looked at him for a long moment. The city moved behind him, constant and indifferent. 10 million lives conducting themselves at once, with no awareness of this particular room and this particular negotiation and the specific ways a person's entire trajectory could pivot on a single conversation. 72 hours, she said, from the moment you sign. I want it in writing, the specific terms, what constitutes the legal documentation, what the public expectations are, what the timeline is, and what happens to both of us at the end of 12 months. Of course. And I want independent legal review of whatever you put in front of me. He nodded once, without irritation, which itself was information. Men who expected complete compliance got irritated when you insisted on safeguards. The absence of irritation meant either that he'd expected this or that he'd already accounted for it, and neither of those options was particularly comforting. I'll have documentation ready by tomorrow morning, he said. She stood. Then I'll have an answer by tomorrow afternoon. She walked out of that room with her spine straight and her breathing controlled and her hands steady, and she maintained all of those things through the elevator, through the lobby, through the revolving door, and out onto the Shinjuku street, and then she leaned against the outside wall of the building in the November cold and pressed the back of her head against the glass and closed her eyes and just breathed, in and out, counting the beats, in, 2, 3, 4. She already knew what her answer was going to be. She'd known it before she sat down. That was the part that frightened her more than anything else. Not that she might say yes, but that she'd already said yes somewhere below the level of conscious decision, in the part of her that loved Marcus more than it feared whatever Kael Arden represented. She hailed a cab and went home and did not sleep. The documents arrived at 8:15 the following morning, delivered by a courier whose neutral professionalism suggested he was accustomed to handling things that required discretion. The envelope was thick. She spread the pages across her kitchen table and spent 4 hours reading them with the same attention she gave to her research, annotating margins, flagging inconsistencies, tracing definitions of terms through the document's own internal logic. The terms were, as promised, specific. Legal marriage filed with appropriate authorities in both Japan and the United States. A 12-month period commencing from the date of signature. Her attendance at no fewer than 3 events per month in Kael Arden's company. Maintenance of the public appearance of the marriage in all shared social contexts. No requirement for cohabitation beyond what specific events necessitated, though a shared residence was strongly recommended for operational efficiency, which was phrasing she circled twice and didn't like. What the document didn't say, she noticed, was almost as informative as what it did. There was no clause prohibiting her from continuing her academic work. No restriction on her communication with Marcus once he was free. The language around physical expectations was absent entirely, which was either a genuine concession or a deliberate gap designed to be filled differently later. She called her professor, a woman named Dr. Okonkwo, whose judgment she trusted more than almost anyone she knew, and without telling her anything specific, asked a series of hypothetical legal questions about contractual coercion and the enforceability of agreements entered under duress. Dr. Okonkwo, who was perceptive in ways that transcended academic expertise, listened carefully and then said, "Nyla, whatever this is, be very, very careful." "I know. Knowing doesn't always help. I know that too." She hung up and signed the documents. 71 hours and 40 minutes later, Marcus walked out of a detention facility into cold sunlight, squinting and thin and wearing the same clothes he'd been arrested in, now wrinkled beyond recovery. The charges had been withdrawn. The witnesses had, separately and without explanation, significantly revised their accounts. New evidence had materialized that pointed investigators toward the actual perpetrators, with enough specificity to make Marcus's presence at the scene categorically irrelevant. Nyla stood at the facility entrance and watched her brother walk toward her and did not cry, because she had cried too much in the past 3 weeks, and she was empty of it for now. And because crying would require her to look away from his face for even a moment, and she wasn't willing to do that. Marcus reached her and grabbed her in a hug that nearly knocked her off her feet. He smelled like institutional soap and something underneath it that was just him. The particular human Marcus smell she'd known since he was born. And she pressed her face into his shoulder and breathed it and held it and tried not to think about what she had signed to get here. "How did you do this?" he said against the top of her head. His voice was rough. The hug was the kind that only happens between people who have genuinely considered the possibility of not having this moment. "Connections," she said. "I'll explain later." "Nyla, later," she said again, pulling back. She looked at him. His eye had healed. The cut on his jaw had closed into a thin line that would scar faintly. He was alive and free, and none of the rest of it was his fault or his burden to carry. She had decided that on the walk to the facility entrance, whatever she had put herself into, Marcus would not know about it. She would handle it, survive it, and end it clean. He would go back to his life, his teaching program, his 23-year-old trajectory, and she would take whatever the next 12 months required. That was her calculation. She had no way of knowing yet how wrong it was, not because her math was bad, but because the equation she was solving had variables she hadn't been told about yet. The life that awaited her inside Kael Arden's world was not the controlled transaction she'd negotiated. It was something stranger and more dangerous, and in the ways that would matter most, completely beyond her psychological framework. But that was still 24 hours away. For now, she stood outside a detention facility in the cold November sunlight with her brother's arm around her shoulders, watching Tokyo move around them both, and let herself have the one pure thing in all of this, the fact that she had gotten him out. Everything else would come soon enough. The car Kael sent for her the following morning was not subtle. Black, long, the kind of vehicle that makes civilians unconsciously give it space on the road the way schooling fish make space for something that doesn't behave like prey. The driver held the door and said nothing. She got in with one bag because she'd been told to bring whatever she needed for 3 days while her arrangement in the Okubo Tower residence was being finalized. She had packed for 3 days, and she had packed deliberately, choosing the clothes that felt most like armor. Clean lines, nothing soft, nothing that asked to be looked at. She looked at her apartment through the car window as they pulled away. The kitchen light she'd forgotten to turn off. The small terrace where she'd put a pot of herbs in the spring that had done surprisingly well through the summer. The familiar grid of her neighborhood resolving into the larger geometry of Tokyo as the car turned. She faced forward and didn't look back again. The drive to Kael's tower took 20 minutes through morning traffic. She spent those minutes doing the things she always did before entering a difficult environment, building a map of what she knew, what she didn't know, and where the pressure points were likely to appear. She knew the terms of the contract. She knew, broadly, what category of world she was entering. She knew her own psychological architecture well enough to identify where she was most vulnerable and where she was most resilient. What she didn't know was Kael Arden. Not truly. Not beneath the performance of the meeting in that 41st floor room, which had been, she was certain, a carefully managed presentation rather than an actual person. She didn't know what he wanted from this arrangement beyond the stated functional requirements. She didn't know what had happened to the women before her, though she'd done enough searching in the days since signing to find patterns she didn't like in the public record. A former business associate's daughter who had briefly been linked to him and then dropped entirely from any social or professional presence. A society page appearance with a woman whose name she couldn't locate in any subsequent search results. She knew enough to be afraid, and she was afraid, and she had decided that fear was not going to be the thing that determined her choices here. The car stopped. The driver opened her door. She looked up at the tower, and the tower was exactly as tall as it had been before, and the city around it was exactly as vast and indifferent. And somewhere in that building, on one of its upper floors, something was beginning that she had no complete name for yet. She picked up her bag and walked toward the entrance. Behind her, without drama or ceremony, the car pulled away. She didn't hear it go. She was already inside, already breathing the climate-controlled air, already watching the elevator doors open ahead of her, already entering the first morning of a year that would take apart everything she thought she understood about herself and put it back together in a shape she hadn't yet imagined. The elevator rose, and in the lobby reflection of the closing doors, she caught her own face for just a moment, eyes steady, jaw set, fear present but controlled beneath the surface, and thought, I know what I'm doing. She had no idea what she was doing, but on the 41st floor a door was about to open, and behind it, for the first time since that silent meeting at the window, she would see Kael Arden in his actual world rather than the one he'd constructed for her. And what she would find there would make her realize, with a cold certainty that landed in the stomach rather than the head, that the contract she had signed was not a transaction at all. It was an introduction. The elevator opened directly into the apartment, which was the first thing that registered as wrong. Not wrong in the way that triggered alarm, wrong in the way that reordered her understanding of scale. She'd been in expensive spaces before. University department heads with their corner offices, the clinical director of the hospital where she'd done her residency hours, who had a private waiting room paneled in actual wood. Those spaces announced wealth through accumulation, the careful stacking of signals. This was different. The apartment, penthouse, she corrected herself, because apartment was inadequate, occupied the entire 41st floor, and it did not announce anything. It simply existed at a register that made announcement unnecessary. Ceilings that disappeared into their own height. Windows on 3 sides that turned Tokyo into something continuous and breathing, the city spreading in every direction to the horizon without interruption, the morning light coming through the glass at an angle that made the air itself look expensive. She stood in the elevator threshold for exactly 1 second before she made herself step forward, because standing in doorways was a tell, and she was not here to give tells. A woman she hadn't seen before was waiting near the entrance. Mid-40s, severe posture, dark hair pulled back with the kind of efficiency that communicated this was functional rather than styled. She introduced herself as Hana and said she managed the residence, and she said it in English with a precision that suggested she'd been told Nyla preferred it, which was itself a piece of information about how thoroughly this arrival had been prepared for. Mr. Arden is in a meeting until 10, Hannah said. I'll show you your room. Your room. Nyla noted that phrasing. Not the room, not a room. The possessive was deliberate, the kind of small territorial language that either comes naturally or gets coached, and she wasn't sure yet which this was. She followed Hannah through the main space, cataloging without appearing to catalog. The books she'd noticed in the meeting room 2 nights ago were replicated here in greater volume. Whole walls of them, the same evidence of actual use, broken spines and mismatched sizes, and the occasional piece of paper tucked in as a marker. A long dining table that could seat 12 and currently seated no one. A kitchen that was either never used or cleaned with obsessive regularity, she couldn't tell which. 2 closed doors that Hannah did not gesture toward. The room she was shown to was at the far end of a corridor, and it was large and quiet and had its own bathroom and a window that looked east. The bed had been made with hotel precision. On the small desk near the window, someone had placed a simple vase with a single stem of something white she didn't know the name of, and the gesture was so unexpectedly human that it caught her off guard for a moment, which was possibly the point. Mr. Arden will meet with you at 10:30 in the main room, Hannah said from the doorway. Breakfast is available whenever you're ready. Thank you, Nyla said. Hannah left. Nyla set her bag on the bed and did not unpack it. She sat on the edge of the mattress and pressed her palms flat against her thighs, and took 3 slow breaths and looked at the white flower on the desk, and thought about the fact that someone had put it there deliberately, had known she was coming, had arranged for that specific, quietly disarming detail to be present at the exact moment she walked in. She thought, I need to understand the mechanics of this place before I can navigate it safely. She thought, I don't have enough information yet. She thought, that flower is a manipulation, and it worked, and that is useful data. She got up, washed her face, and went to find breakfast. He was already in the main room when she arrived at 10:28. He was on the phone, standing at the eastern windows, speaking in Japanese too rapid and idiomatic for her intermediate proficiency to follow completely. She caught fragments, numbers, a name she didn't recognize, something that might have been a location. He turned when she entered, held up one finger in the universal gesture for a moment, and she sat in one of the chairs near the low table and waited without performing patience. The call ended. He set the phone face down on the window ledge, which she noted because people who set their phones face down around new people are either hiding information or testing to see if you'll look, and sometimes both at once. How was the room? He said, crossing toward her. Fine. The flower was Hannah's idea. She thinks first impressions matter. She's right. He sat. In this light, at this hour, he looked less composed than he had 2 nights ago, and she tried to determine whether that was genuine or a different kind of performance, the calculated drop of the mask to encourage intimacy. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there before. His shirt was untucked at the back where he'd been moving quickly, the small physical tell of a morning that had not gone as planned. There are things about how this works that I need to explain, he said. Then explain them. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was almost appreciative and almost something harder than that. You don't make anything easy. You didn't hire me to make things easy. No, he agreed. I didn't. He laid it out with the same precise efficiency as the contract documents. The first public event was in 11 days, a charitable foundation dinner attended by the heads of 4 major organizations whose support his family's legitimate business interests required. She would be introduced as his wife. The marriage documentation was already processed and filed. As far as the world that mattered to Kael Arden was concerned, they had been married in a private ceremony 3 weeks ago during what would appear on public record as a trip to Kyoto. 3 weeks ago, she said, when I was trying to get my brother out of detention. Timing was necessary. I'm sure it was. She kept her voice level. Who knows the truth? Hannah, my head of security, Rio. 2 others whose discretion is absolute. Your father? Something shifted in his face, slight but real. My father knows I'm married. He doesn't know the specific arrangement. Why? Because my father, Kael said, and his voice had changed too. Not louder, but denser, the way air gets before weather, is not someone whose knowledge of your situation would benefit you. She filed that away and kept going. What are the rules inside this space? Rules? Between us, when there's no audience. What are the expectations? He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a plane crossed the sky above the city, too high to hear. No expectations. This is your home for 12 months. Your work continues. Your access to Marcus continues. The only time the performance is required is in front of specific people, and you'll always know in advance when those situations are coming. And when you want something that isn't in the contract. I ask, he said. You say yes or no. That's all. It was the right answer. She recognized it as such. She also recognized that right answers, given smoothly and without hesitation, sometimes meant the person had been prepared for the question rather than answering honestly, and she didn't have enough data yet to know which this was. All right, she said. That's it? For now, she said. I have 11 days to learn what I need to learn before that dinner. I'd suggest we use them. She did not see much of him for the first 4 days. He moved through the apartment on a schedule that felt entirely external. Calls from early morning, people arriving and departing through a service entrance she hadn't known existed, the muffled density of conversations behind closed doors. She occupied the spaces he wasn't in. She worked at the eastern desk in her room and at the long dining table when she needed more surface area. She explored the apartment methodically, the way she explored any new environment, mapping its logic. She learned where the coffee was and that the espresso machine had a setting nobody had explained to her, but that she figured out on the second morning. She learned that Hannah communicated primarily through action rather than language. Things would appear that Nyla needed before she knew she needed them. A different pillow when Nyla had mentioned once, casually, that she slept better without too much height, a particular brand of tea that she hadn't asked for, and couldn't explain how Hannah had known she preferred. The effect was comfort that felt slightly like surveillance, and she wasn't sure the distinction mattered in practice. She learned that Kael did not sleep through the night. She knew this because she didn't either, and in the particular quiet of the apartment at 2 and 3 in the morning, sound carried differently, not loudly. The space was too large for that, but she could hear or feel the specific quality of someone else being awake. Light under a door. The low register of a voice on a phone call held too quiet to carry, but present nonetheless. One night, passing through the main room for water at 2:45, she saw him standing at the western window in the dark. Not on the phone, not doing anything, just standing in the city's ambient light with his back to the room and his shoulders carrying something she didn't have a name for yet. She went back to bed without speaking. In the morning, she thought about what she'd seen, and thought about the insomnia, and thought about the controlled density of him in the daytime, the careful management of every response, the slight over-precision of someone who has learned that losing control of their reactions has costs. And she began, against her better judgment, to file these observations not as tactical intelligence, but as the beginnings of a psychological portrait. That was a mistake, she told herself. She kept doing it anyway. On the 5th day, a man named Rio briefed her on security protocols with the brisk thoroughness of someone who considered emotional comfort irrelevant to the transmission of information. He was mid-30s, compact, with the specific economy of movement she associated with people who had been trained to neutralize threats before they became threats. He walked her through exit routes, explained what phrases would signal that she needed extraction from a social situation, told her that she would have a contact number active at all hours and that using it was not a weakness but a protocol. Has it ever been used? She asked. Once, Rio said. By whom? He looked at her without expression. That information isn't mine to share. After the briefing, she caught Kael in the main room between calls and said, Tell me about the women before me. He didn't flinch. That was interesting. What do you want to know? What happened to them? He sat down, which she hadn't expected. There were 2. The first was an arrangement similar to this one, different circumstances. She left after 4 months. She's teaching at a university in Edinburgh now. She's fine. He said fine with the weighted carefulness of someone who had checked. The second wasn't an arrangement. That was genuine. It ended badly. How badly? She spent 6 weeks in a clinic, he said. She's recovered. She got married last year. She doesn't think about me. A pause. Or she shouldn't. Why the clinic? His jaw shifted once. Because I didn't know then what I was capable of in terms of... I didn't have a clear picture of how I affected the people close to me. I thought protection meant control. I thought the tighter I held something, the safer it was. I was wrong. Did someone tell you that, or did you figure it out yourself? I had about 14 months of very expensive professional help that told me that. She looked at him. You're in therapy. I was. Still go twice a month. That was genuinely surprising, and she let it show enough that he noticed. What? He said. Nothing. It's... She stopped. That's more self-awareness than I expected. That an evaluation? Observation. Same thing in your field. Not always, she said. And then, because she needed to know, and because she had decided that direct questions were more useful than inference, is what happened to the second woman possible here? With me? Is that something I should be preparing for? The silence that followed was long enough that she felt it physically, a change in the room's pressure. When he answered, his voice was not the managed instrument it usually was. It was something rawer, and she didn't know if that was real or a different layer of performance, but it sounded like something that cost him. I don't know, he said. That's the most honest answer I can give you. I know what I was. I don't know with certainty what I am now. What I can tell you is that this contract exists partly because I needed someone who could hold their own ground, someone I couldn't consume. He met her eyes. I chose you very specifically because of that. I know, she said. Something changed in his face. I noticed, she continued carefully, that you knew things about me that a stranger wouldn't know. Your file on me. I haven't seen it, but I know it exists. I'd like you to tell me what's in it. The silence this time was different, heavier. Not yet, he said. That's not... Not yet, he said again, and this time there was the edge in it, the density she'd felt before, the thing underneath the controlled surface that pressed outward without breaking through. When you know more about this world and what I needed and why, it'll make more sense. Right now, it'll just make you angry. I'm already angry. Then wait until you're angry with context, he said, instead of angry without it. She wanted to push. She had every instinct to push. She made herself not, because she recognized, and this was the observation she trusted most, the clinical read she'd been doing since she sat down, that he wasn't deflecting because he was ashamed. He was deflecting because he was afraid, in some subterranean and probably unacknowledged way, of what her reaction would be. That fear was data. Important data. She filed it. Fine, she said. But soon. Soon, he agreed. What? The foundation dinner arrived with the speed that high-pressure events always did, the 11 days collapsing into a blur of preparation that Hannah managed with terrifying competence. There was a dress, selected after what turned out to be a 20-minute conversation between Nyla and Hannah about what she would and would not wear, which Nyla won more of than she expected. There were names to memorize, faces matched to roles matched to the specific pressures each person represented in Kael's organizational world. There was, on the morning of the event, a briefing from Kael himself at the dining table with printed photographs and handwritten notes that she found unexpectedly thorough. He had annotated the notes in the margins, small observations about personality and weakness and which people required warmth versus formality, and the annotations were perceptive enough that she found herself revising her understanding of him slightly, reluctantly, in the direction of complexity. Takeshi Mori, she said, studying one photograph. You've written that he responds to peer validation more than direct authority. He's the second son, Kael said. Spent 30 years overperforming for his father's attention and never got it. Compliment something specific and technical, and he'll spend the rest of the night considering you an ally. And this woman, Celine Voss, something changed in his posture. Barely perceptible, but she was sitting 18 inches from him, and she caught it. She's my father's strategist. Officially, she handles international business development. Her actual function is... He paused. Watch her. Don't engage unless she approaches you first. And if she says anything to you that doesn't seem directly related to small talk, remember it exactly and tell me afterward. Should I be worried about her? You should be careful around everyone in that room, he said. But yes, especially her. The dinner itself was held in a private space on the 52nd floor of a hotel whose public identity bore no obvious relationship to the purposes it served on its upper levels. She arrived on Kael's arm in the dress she'd negotiated for, which was dark and structured and made no concessions, and she watched how the room reorganized itself around his entrance, Not loudly, not with performance, but the subtle gravitational shift of people reorienting toward a center of power. She held his arm with the ease of practice she didn't have, which required her to focus a significant portion of her attention on physical calibration while simultaneously running the social read she needed to run. It was the most cognitively demanding 40 minutes she'd spent in recent memory. She found Takeshi Mori by the far end of the room and spent 8 minutes with him discussing the structural logistics of philanthropic trusts in cross-border contexts with enough specific competence that she watched him recalibrate her threat level twice within the same conversation. By the time she rejoined Kael, she could feel from the slight shift in his posture that he'd been watching and that her performance had landed. "Well done," he said quietly, near her ear. "I know," she said. His mouth did the thing that wasn't quite a smile. Celine Voss found her 40 minutes later near the edge of the room, during a moment when Kael was across the floor in a conversation she could see but not hear. She was in her 50s, elegant in the way that comes from years of calculated self-presentation, with eyes that assessed and cataloged without pause. She introduced herself with the smooth warmth of someone who had been doing professional warmth for decades and knew exactly when to apply it. They talked for 3 minutes about nothing, and then, without any transitional shift in tone, Celine said, "He's chosen well this time." Nyla felt the specific quality of attention that comes with a loaded statement. "Excuse me?" Kael, his previous choices were a small, considered pause. "He tends toward people who will break. It's a pattern. Something about confirmation, perhaps." She tilted her head, the slight angle of someone sharing confidence. "You seem less breakable." "I don't know what you mean," Nyla said, which was a lie, and which Celine almost certainly knew was a lie. "Of course not," Celine said, with a smile that contained several things. "Enjoy the evening." She moved away with the smooth unhurriedness of someone who has just planted something and is not in a hurry to watch it grow. Nyla stood where she was for a moment, holding her glass, and thought about Kael's instruction. Remember it exactly. And thought about the specific phrasing, "He tends toward people who will break," and thought about the second woman in the clinic, and thought about the file she hadn't seen yet, and felt the particular kind of cold that isn't temperature. She found Kael. She told him what Celine had said, word for word. His face did something complex and controlled, a sequence of small movements that resolved into stillness. "Good," he said, which was not the response she expected. "She's testing to see how much you know." "How much do I know?" He looked at her. "Enough to be dangerous," he said. "Not enough to understand yet." That was the night she started watching him the way she watched patients. Not clinically, not with the trained distance of professional observation, but with the kind of attention that comes from needing to understand something for reasons that are more personal than they should be. And that was the night he started watching her back, with the particular careful attention of someone who has spent a long time believing that the things he loved were objects to be contained, encountering for the first time something that would not be contained and not quite knowing what to do with the discovery. It was 2 weeks after the foundation dinner when she found it. She hadn't been looking. That was what she would tell herself afterward, though she would also be honest enough with herself to acknowledge that she had been aware, in some peripheral and deliberate way, of the boundaries between her access and Kael's private space, and that her awareness of those boundaries had always carried the specific quality of awareness that precedes a decision. She was looking for a phone charger. That was true. She'd left hers in the room and her phone was dying, and the spare she'd been using had stopped working, and Kael was gone for the day. A meeting in Osaka, back by evening, and she'd tried 3 drawers in the main room before she opened the wrong one. The folder was inside. Physical paper, not digital, in a manila sleeve with no label. She stood with the drawer open and the folder in her hand and the phone dying on the table beside her, and she thought, "Don't." She opened it. The photograph on top was her, taken from a distance, on the campus of her university, in sunlight that she calculated as late October. 3 months ago, approximately 6 weeks before her brother was arrested. She was walking toward the library with her bag over one shoulder. She had absolutely no awareness of being photographed. Underneath it were others. Her apartment building, the cafe where she worked 3 mornings a week because she needed the ambient noise and the coffee was better than anything she could make herself. Marcus's neighborhood. Notes typed and annotated by hand about her academic background, her psychological profile, her resilience indicators, her potential leverage vectors. That phrase, in a handwriting she didn't recognize with a circle around it. Potential leverage vectors. Deeper in the folder, a formal document titled Candidate Assessment, dated 4 months ago, with a photograph of her attached and a scoring matrix underneath it. Categories she couldn't fully parse through the redness that was building at the edges of her vision. Psychological stability, social adaptability, physical presentation, likelihood of long-term compliance, scored, in a table, alongside her photograph. The last document was in a different hand. Kael's, she thought. She'd seen it on the annotated briefing notes from the dinner. 3 lines. Profile matches. Initiate contact protocol. Note: the brother situation provides the leverage window. The brother situation. Marcus hadn't been a coincidence. Marcus's arrest hadn't been a coincidence. It had been... She stood very still with this information, holding the folder, feeling something move through her chest that was too large and too hot to be processed quickly. It had been a mechanism. Not orchestrated by Kael, maybe. Maybe the shooting had been real. The gang dispute had been real. But Kael, or someone in his organization, had identified it, had seen it as a window, had chosen the specific timing of his approach based on its leverage potential. Her brother's suffering, her 71 hours of panic and helplessness, and running every direction and finding every door closed. A leverage window. She set the folder down. She set it down very carefully because she was afraid of what she would do if she held it for another second. She sat on the edge of the couch with her hands pressed flat against her knees, and the city moved outside the windows with its usual colossal indifference, and she breathed and breathed and breathed. She had been selected. She had been engineered toward this exact position. Every perceived coincidence, every moment that had felt like desperation and chance, had been operating inside a structure she hadn't been told about. The hotel meeting, the text from an anonymous number at her lowest point, the emotional intimacy of that first conversation, which had felt genuine, in which she now had to hold up to the light of this new information and examine like a document she'd been handed in the wrong language. The file. She already knew what she was going to do with this. She wasn't going to confront him immediately, because immediate confrontation was satisfying and strategically useless. She was going to wait. She was going to breathe through this and think and decide how to use what she now knew. But somewhere beneath the clinical decision-making, something else was happening. Something that she did not have a professional framework for because it was not a professional feeling. It was the specific grief of betrayal. Not surprised, because on some level she had known there was a file. He'd told her there was information she didn't have yet. But the specificity of it, the scored table, the circled phrase, the handwriting that had turned her suffering into a mechanism, that was not something she had prepared for. She was still sitting there with her hands flat on her knees when she heard the elevator engage, returning from the lobby, and she knew from the time that it was Kael, back from Osaka early, and she had approximately 45 seconds to decide how to arrange her face. She stood. She moved the folder to where she'd found it and closed the drawer. She picked up her dying phone from the table. When the elevator opened and he walked in, carrying his jacket and already starting to speak, "Osaka ran short. There's a dinner situation I need to talk to you about." She was standing at the window with her back to the room in the exact position she'd first seen him in, and she let him finish his sentence before she turned. Her face gave him nothing. "Okay," she said. "Tell me." She watched him read her neutrality and not quite be sure what to do with it. That slight hesitation before he shifted into the logistical briefing, and she thought, he doesn't know yet what I found. And she thought, when I confront him, it will be on my terms, not his. And underneath that, quiet and cold and very certain. Everything I thought I was building here just changed, and there is no version of the next conversation that doesn't break something that cannot be put back together. The dinner situation. His voice, continuing. The city outside, vast and humming and entirely without opinion. She listened. She did not let anything show, and in the drawer across the room, behind her, the folder sat in the dark, and every word in it sat in the dark with it, waiting for the moment when she would decide to let them into the light. And when that moment came, there would be no going back to the careful transaction she'd believed she'd signed. There would only be what came after. She waited 4 days. 4 days of watching him across the dining table while he briefed her on the next event. 4 days of sitting in the same room and maintaining the performance of a woman who had not read a folder that scored her psychological stability on a numerical scale and circled the phrase leverage window in red ink. 4 days of waking at 3 in the morning with the specific, grinding alertness of someone whose nervous system had not received the message that the immediate crisis was over. She was very good at waiting. She had learned it young, in the particular school of a childhood where reading a room before acting was not a social skill but a survival mechanism. She knew how to hold something inside her chest without letting it change the surface. She knew how to be completely present in a conversation while the real processing happened somewhere below the waterline. What she hadn't anticipated was how much harder it would be to hold when he was himself, whatever himself meant. The person she'd been building a picture of since she arrived, the insomniac and the annotated books and the careful twice-monthly therapy and the way he watched her when he thought she wasn't watching him. The file had not erased that picture. It had layered something poisonous over it, and the poisonous layer and the real one existed simultaneously, and that coexistence was its own particular violence. On the 4th evening, he cooked. She hadn't known he cooked. Hana was absent, some family obligation she'd mentioned the previous morning, and Nyla had been planning on ordering something, had been standing in the kitchen looking at her phone, when he came in from a call and looked at the empty counter and said, without particular emphasis, "I'll make something." She sat at the kitchen island and watched him move through the space with the same economy he brought to everything. No wasted motion, no performance of domesticity, just the focused attention of someone who was actually present in the task. He made something with noodles and a broth that took 40 minutes and filled the apartment with a smell that was warm enough to be disarming, and she sat there and watched and held the folder's contents in her chest like a coal and thought about timing. He set a bowl in front of her. He sat across from her with his own. They ate in the particular silence of two people who have developed, without discussing it, a specific vocabulary of shared quiet. "You went to Osaka alone," she said, without looking up from the bowl. "I always go to Osaka alone." "Why?" "It's one of the few situations where having someone with me makes the other party less comfortable." She looked up. "What party?" A pause. "A distribution arrangement that's been in the family for 30 years, and that I'm in the process of restructuring. The man who runs the Osaka end of it is old enough to be my grandfather and has specific ideas about what meetings look like." "What kind of restructuring?" He considered her for a moment, and she could see him deciding how much to say, running the calculation that she'd watched him run every time she asked a question that touched the real shape of his world. The kind that moves things away from certain activities and toward others, cleaner activities. Slower money, less risk, less collateral. Collateral meaning people. "Yes." "Why?" He put down his chopsticks. "Why what?" "Why clean it up? You inherited an empire. Most people in your position don't dismantle the thing that gives them power." "I'm not dismantling it, I'm reshaping it." "Why?" He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a slow rain had started, the particular soft rain of Tokyo autumn that blurred the city lights into something impressionistic. "Because I've seen what happens to the people inside it over time," he said finally. "What it does to them. What it did to my father. What it was starting to do to me." She thought about the folder, about the scoring matrix, about what it meant that a man in the process of reshaping his empire had also engineered the recruitment of a wife with the same organizational precision he would apply to any other operational need. "I want to ask you something," she said. "All right. And I want you to answer me without managing the answer first." Something moved across his face. "That's a specific request." "I know." He picked up his chopsticks again. Put them down again. The rain moved against the windows. "Ask." "Did you know about my brother before he was arrested?" The silence had a quality she could feel in her sternum. She watched his jaw. His hands, flat now on the countertop. The specific way a person goes still when they are deciding something at speed under conditions that don't allow for the usual runway. "Yes," he said. The coal in her chest went cold and hard. "How long before?" 2 months. "You knew Marcus was in Tokyo." "I knew you were in Tokyo. Monitoring your proximity to..." "There was an ongoing situation in Shimokitazawa that my organization was tracking. Your brother's presence in that neighborhood registered as a factor." A factor, she said. Nyla, you knew there was an ongoing situation in the neighborhood where my brother lived, she said, and her voice was very level, which was the voice she used when the alternative was not level at all. And you didn't... She stopped, started again. Did you know the shooting was going to happen? No. Immediate. Hard-edged. I did not know that. The timing of that was not... He stopped. I want to be very clear about this. The shooting was not arranged. What happened to Marcus was not something I caused. But you used it. The word used landed in the room like a physical thing. She watched it land on him, watched him not flinch away from it, which was the only thing in this conversation that was going the way she'd hoped anything would go. Yes, he said. She pushed back from the island and stood. She needed to not be sitting. Sitting felt too much like a position of managed composure, and managed composure was not what she had access to right now. She moved to the window and stood with her back to him and looked at the blurred lights and the rain and breathed. The file, she said to the window. Behind her, complete silence. I found it 4 days ago, she said. The candidate assessment, the scoring matrix, the photographs from October, the note in your handwriting that said the brother situation provides the leverage window. She turned. I've been waiting to see how long it would take you to tell me. He was standing now, too. She didn't know when he'd stood. He was on the other side of the island with his hands at his sides, and something on his face that she didn't have a clean clinical label for. Not guilt exactly, because guilt was simpler than this. Guilt was a single register emotion, and what she was looking at was a chord. Multiple things struck at once. How long were you going to wait? He asked. Until I understood what I was going to do with it. And do you? Not yet, she said, but I understand what you did. I want you to explain it to me, not justify it. Explain it. The decision logic, what you needed, why me specifically, all of it. He was quiet for a long enough time that she thought he was going to defer again, give her the not yet that he'd given her before, and she was already building the response to that in the back of her mind. But he didn't. Sit down, he said. I'm fine standing. I know you are. I'm asking anyway. She sat. Not because he asked, but because she needed her feet under her for what was coming, and standing was actually less stable than sitting. A fact about her own physiology she'd learned in her first year of clinical training during her first genuinely difficult patient interview. He told her, all of it, with the systematic honesty of a man who had run out of reasons to be strategic about this particular truth. The heir situation, his father's mounting pressure over the past 2 years for Kael to produce a marriage, and by extension an heir, pressure that had moved from expectation to ultimatum to direct interference in Kael's organizational authority. The previous 2 arrangements, the first woman, who had been too frightened to be functional in his world, the second, about whom he said nothing different from what he'd already told her, but whose memory she could see was not clean for him in ways that went beyond responsibility. The decision to be more systematic. The profiling process, run by people in his organization who had done this kind of assessment in completely different contexts, talent acquisition for operational roles, applied to the question of what profile of person could survive what being Kael Arden's visible partner actually required. Not someone from his world who would come with existing loyalties and liabilities. Not someone with no backbone who would bend until they broke. Someone with intelligence, psychological architecture capable of reading threat, professional discipline, and the fortitude to hold their ground with me, he said. Specifically, with me. Because the last woman couldn't. Because I don't know how to love something without... He stopped. His jaw worked once. I needed someone who could push back, who wouldn't dissolve, someone I couldn't consume without them consuming me first. The rain against the windows, the city behind it, gone soft and indistinct. And Marcus, she said, when the situation in Shimokitazawa developed and your brother became entangled in it, I already knew who you were. I'd been watching the profile. The contact had been scheduled for 2 weeks out. He met her eyes. The arrest accelerated the timeline and provided the mechanism. It was... He exhaled slowly. It was efficient, and it was wrong. Both of those things are true. You knew I'd say yes if my brother needed saving. I knew it was the only offer you'd accept. Anything else, you would have looked for the angle and walked away. So you engineered a situation where I had no angle and no exit. Yes. She looked at him. At the careful, controlled stillness of a man who was not, she realized, defending any of this. He was not managing her toward a more comfortable version of events. He was sitting in it with her, in the full weight of what he'd done, without the escape of rationalization. That was almost worse than if he'd lied. I need you to leave me alone tonight, she said. He nodded once. He left. She sat at the kitchen island for a long time, in the apartment that was not hers, in the city she had not chosen, in the year she had signed away, and she thought about everything she had learned and everything she still didn't know, and she thought about Marcus at home in Chicago with his whole life intact, and she thought about what it meant that the man who had engineered her captivity was also the man who couldn't sleep through the night. She thought, I don't forgive this. She thought, I don't know what I do with it. She did not see Kael for 2 days after that conversation. She moved through the apartment like a person occupying a temporary space, deliberate, minimal, leaving no impression. She worked. She called Marcus twice, both times holding the phone with both hands, listening to his voice with the specific attention of someone who is very aware that they are listening. He was fine. He was good, actually. Back at the teaching program, cautiously recalibrating to normal life, asking her questions about her research with the interest he'd always had in her work. She told him nothing. She laughed in the right places. After she hung up the second time, she stayed with the phone in her lap for a while. It was Hannah who broke the 2-day silence, in the practical, non-intrusive way Hannah did most things. She knocked on Nyla's door on the morning of the 3rd day and told her that there was a situation she needed to know about, and her delivery of the word situation had enough specific weight that Nyla was off the bed and following her into the main room before the full sentence had finished. Kael was there. He looked like someone who had spent the 2-day interval in conditions not substantially better than hers. He was on a call, and she could tell from the tenor of it, even without following the Japanese, that it was not going well. And when he ended it and turned, there was something on his face that was different from anything she'd seen there before. My father wants to meet you, he said. She felt the shift. The specific quality of dread that comes from a threat you've been told is present, announcing its actual arrival. When? Tonight. He's called a dinner. Family, key associates. He's been told about the marriage, officially, via his own intelligence, which means he's been building a file on you independently, and he's now decided he wants to see you in person. That was fast. He moves fast when he's concerned. Is he concerned? Kael looked at her with something that was almost bleak. He's concerned that I married someone outside his approval process, which I did. He'll want to evaluate you, determine whether you're a threat to his interests, a useful asset, or a liability. And which one am I? That depends entirely on the next 4 hours and how we handle this. She thought about the folder, about candidate assessments and leverage windows, and the fact that she was standing in this apartment because this man's father had applied enough pressure to drive Kael toward a systematic solution to a matrimonial problem. She thought about the chain of causality that linked Magnus Arden's ambitions directly to Marcus in a detention cell and to her in a room at 3 a.m, unable to sleep. Tell me about him, she said. Everything. Magnus Arden occupied his space the way ancient geological features occupied theirs, not aggressively, not demonstrably, but with the specific authority of something that had been there long enough that the landscape had simply arranged itself around it. He was 67 and looked approximately that. No artifice of fitness or surgical youth management, a heaviness in the body that was not slovenliness but density, the physical accumulation of decades of consequence. His eyes were the same dark as Kael's and operated on an entirely different frequency. Where Kael's held the controlled intensity of someone managing their own nature, Magnus's eyes held nothing in reserve. They assessed and categorized without the slightest pretense of social courtesy. The dinner was at the Arden family property outside the city, 40 minutes by car, through rain that had continued from the night before. The property was old money-made architectural, not modern glass and steel, but a building that had been there long enough to have absorbed history into its walls. Japanese traditional structure expanded and modified over generations into something that was neither traditional nor Western, but its own dense, private thing. There were 8 people at the table. She knew 3 of them from briefing photographs. Celine Voss was present, seated 2 positions from Magnus on his right, and the recognition between them, Nyla and Celine, was brief and mutual, and performed as simple courtesy for the room's benefit. Magnus watched Nyla through the first 2 courses without speaking directly to her, which she recognized as a tactic and treated accordingly, not performing comfort, not performing anxiety, simply being present in the conversation that existed around his silence. When he spoke to her, it was in English, which was a choice about control rather than consideration. "My son tells me very little," Magnus said, setting down his chopsticks with the deliberate precision of a man who used even utensils as instruments of emphasis. "This is not new. What is new is that he has made a significant decision without my knowledge." "People get married without parental approval all the time," Nyla said. "In civilian life. This is not civilian life." "I'm aware of that." Magnus looked at her. The specific extended look of someone for whom attention is a tool. "You're a psychologist." "Graduate researcher. Studying coercive relationships." She felt the air in the room realign slightly. Across the table, Kael's hand had gone still against his glass. "Among other things, interesting specialty for someone who chose to marry my son." "I find a lot of things interesting," she said. The corner of Magnus's mouth moved in a way that was not warmth. "I want to understand what my son offered you," he said, "and what you offered him, because I've been watching my son for 30 years, and I know the shape of his decisions, and you are not the shape of a decision he makes for conventional reasons." "Then perhaps you should ask him." "I'm asking you." The weight in that, not a threat yet, but the infrastructure of a threat. The way you feel a building's load-bearing structure before you see it. What do you want from this family? "The same thing anyone wants," Nyla said. "A life that makes sense." "That's an evasion dressed as an answer." "Yes," she said, "it is." Magnus held her gaze for another long moment. Then he made a small sound that might have been appreciation in a different man, and returned to his food, and the conversation moved elsewhere. She felt Kael's posture change beside her. The fractional release of tension she'd learned to read from weeks of sitting close to him. And she filed the whole exchange and kept eating. She had passed something. She wasn't sure what or what passing it cost. She found out approximately 3 hours later. She was in the hallway outside the main dining room, waiting for the car, when Celine materialized from a side corridor with the quiet appearance of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment and had engineered it accordingly. "He'll use the brother again," Celine said. No preamble. Low voice, level and conversational, as if this were small talk. "Magnus? He liked you tonight, which in his framework means you're either useful or dangerous. And either way, the most effective control mechanism is the same. Your brother's freedom is not permanent. It was a transaction with a specific architecture. Magnus understands that architecture." A pause. "He'll wait until you've settled, until you feel stable. Then he'll remind you that stability is provisional." Nyla felt the cold again. The specific cold. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I have been watching Magnus Arden operate for 22 years, Celine said, "and I am very tired of watching what he does to the people around him." Her voice carried something controlled and long-held, the tone of a specific fury that has had decades to calcify into purpose. "And because you're smarter than the others were, and because you might be someone who does something with information instead of just drowning in it." "What do you want me to do with it?" "Not yet," Celine said, which was the same answer Kael had given her about the file, and the repetition of it hit her in a way she couldn't immediately categorize. "But stay close to Kael. Stay closer than your contract requires. What happens next will need both of you." The car's headlights appeared at the end of the drive. Celine was already gone, back into the corridor, and the side hallway was empty as if the conversation hadn't happened. Nyla stood in the cold air with the lights approaching and ran the conversation again in her mind, checking it for construction, for the engineering of another situation designed to produce a particular response. She did not know yet whether Celine was an ally or a more sophisticated version of the same trap. She got into the car beside Kael and sat in the traveling dark, while the property's lights receded and the city began rebuilding itself around them, and she told him exactly what Celine had said. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, the silence went on long enough that she could count the streetlights strobing through the rain-wet window. "She's right about my father," he said finally. "Is she right about the brother?" Another pause. "He could do it," Kael said. "He has enough reach to reopen the case if he wanted to. The evidence was managed, not destroyed. The witnesses are accessible. He'd need a reason, and you gave him a good impression tonight, which buys time, but I'm a variable he doesn't control," Nyla said. "Yes. And variables he doesn't control eventually become problems he solves." She pressed the back of her head against the seat, looked at the car's ceiling, felt the specific, awful clarity of a situation that has stopped being theoretical. So the contract that was supposed to be a transaction is actually a cage, and the year I agreed to is not actually the frame, and my brother's freedom is not actually secured, and everything I signed, and everything I gave up to sign it, was operating inside a larger structure I wasn't told about. Kael said nothing. "Say something," she said. "I don't have anything useful to say right now," he said. "I'm sorry isn't useful. It's true, but it's not useful." She turned her head and looked at him. In the shifting light of the car, his face was stripped of its daytime management. Not raw exactly, but genuine, the exhaustion and the weight of it visible in ways she'd only glimpsed before. He looked like someone sitting with a consequence he'd known was coming, and had not been able to stop, and was not pretending otherwise. "I need you to understand something," she said. "You built this. Whatever your father does next, you built the conditions for it. You brought me into a structure with this architecture and told me it was a clean transaction, and it wasn't. And I can't be angry at you and also need you to help me get out of this, so I'm choosing to set the anger aside. For now. Not because it doesn't exist, but because I don't have the luxury of it right now." "I understand that." "Good," she said, "because starting tomorrow we're not operating as a performance for anyone's benefit. If your father is going to come at Marcus, we need to know everything about how he would do it and what stops him. And the only way we build that is if you actually tell me everything, not on a timeline that feels comfortable for you. All of it, now." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, Tokyo had rebuilt itself around them, vast and humming and indifferent, the millions of lives conducting themselves with no awareness of this car and what was being decided in it. "All right," he said. He talked for the rest of the drive. What she learned in those 40 minutes restructured everything. Magnus Arden had, over the course of 30 years, assembled not just a criminal organization, but a shadow infrastructure that intersected with legitimate institutions at enough points that its removal could not be accomplished from the outside without collateral damage that no external authority had the appetite for. The 3 attempts by various international bodies to mount cases against the Arden operation had each collapsed at the evidence stage. Not because the evidence didn't exist, but because the people positioned to present it had, in each case, encountered persuasive reasons to reconsider. Kael had been building a counterstructure for 2 years, quietly, systematically, with the patience of someone who understood that impatience in this context was fatal. He had moved money. He had cultivated allies within the organization who were, like him, invested in a different future. He had assembled documentation, not the kind that could be interdicted before reaching the right people, but the kind housed in locations Magnus didn't know about, with people Magnus couldn't reach. "How close are you?" she asked. 6 months, he said. "Maybe 8. The Osaka restructuring is part of it. If I can move the distribution network's financial architecture before my father realizes what I'm doing, he'll realize before 6 months. Probably. And when he does?" Kael looked at his hands. "Then it becomes a different kind of problem. He'll come at Marcus. Yes. As leverage over you. Yes." She thought about Magnus at the dinner table, the patient, geological authority of him. The 22 years Celine had spent watching him, the 3 collapses of external prosecution, the weight of a structure that had made itself necessary to too many things to be removed cleanly. "You need to accelerate," she said. "Accelerating breaks things. Things are going to break anyway." She turned to face him fully. "You've been moving carefully because careful was safe. It's not safe anymore. He already has my number. He's already running his own assessment. The window you've been working inside is closing faster than your timeline assumed." I know, he said, and then quietly, I didn't expect to have to do this with someone. You don't get to not do it with someone, she said. You brought me into this. I'm here, and I have a skill set you haven't fully used yet. He looked at her. Psychology, she said. You've been thinking about this as a logistics problem. Money, documentation, organizational structure. But the people at your father's table, the ones whose support you need, the ones he keeps loyal through fear and debt and 3 decades of accumulated obligation, those are psychological problems. She held his gaze. I spent 4 years studying exactly this. Coercive systems, how they sustain themselves, how they collapse. What moves people toward an exit when every logical incentive says to stay. She watched something shift in him. Not hope exactly, because hope was a luxury both of them had learned to handle carefully, but something adjacent. A recalibration. There's a gathering, he said slowly, in 3 weeks. My father holds it annually. The heads of 5 affiliated families, the senior figures of 2 legitimate business bodies, and 3 men whose support has kept him in power longer than his own capabilities should have allowed. A pause. If those 3 men shifted their position, then his foundation moves, she said. It would need to be done in person, in the room. I know, she said. You'd be walking into a room full of people who have done very violent things. I know, she said again. Tell me about the 3 men. He told her. She listened with the specific, hungry attention of someone who has spent years building a set of tools and has just been handed the exact problem those tools were designed for. And underneath that attention, underneath the clean clinical engagement with the strategic problem, something else was also happening. Something she did not examine closely yet, because it was complicated and she was not ready for it to be complicated. She was not in this because she wanted to be. She was not choosing Kael Arden's world because some part of her had been won over. She was choosing it because Marcus was in the world, and Magnus Arden had made Marcus's safety contingent on her compliance, and no one, not a scoring matrix, not a leverage window, not a crime emperor with 30 years of institutional violence behind him, was going to use her brother as an instrument. That was what she told herself. It was also, in some specific and dangerous ways, not the complete truth. But there was no time for the complete truth right now because 3 weeks was not long, and the room she was going to walk into was full of the kind of men who could smell preparation and mistake it for threat, and she had work to do. She pressed her back against the car seat and watched Tokyo stream past in the rain and began quietly to plan something that would either save both of them or destroy everything they had left to. 3 weeks was not enough time. She knew that going in, and she built her preparation around the constraint rather than pretending it didn't exist. 21 days, 3 of which Kael needed for logistics she wasn't involved in. The movement of documentation to a secured location outside the country, the quiet communication with 2 of his internal allies whose participation in what happened at the gathering would be critical. That left 18 days of actual working time, and she used every hour of them. She started with the 3 men. Kael had given her names and histories in the car, and she had spent the following morning extracting everything available through the research channels she had legitimate access to. Academic databases, business registries, the formal public record of 3 men who had been very careful about what they allowed into the formal public record. What she found was thin on specifics and dense with implication, the kind of thinness that is itself a shape. She went back to Kael that afternoon with a list of questions that took him 3 hours to answer fully. She listened. She asked follow-ups. She built profiles the way she built clinical case studies, not from the outside in, the observable behavior and the documented history, but from the inside out, the motivational architecture, the specific fears and appetites that had made each of these men choose the particular form of loyalty they had chosen. The first was a man named Daisuke Funo, 61, whose connection to Magnus went back to a debt incurred in the early years of the operation that had never been formally resolved, which meant Magnus had been holding it as an instrument for 30 years, and Funo knew it and had been performing loyalty partly from genuine alignment and partly from the specific exhaustion of someone who has been owned for so long that they've stopped imagining a different arrangement. The second was a man named Victor Chasen, Swiss-Japanese, who ran the legitimate face of 2 of the organization's financial vehicles, and who had, according to Kael, been making incremental moves for 18 months, that suggested he was looking for a different position, not against Magnus, but adjacent to a future that didn't depend entirely on Magnus's continued power. The third was harder. His name was Hiro Tamaki, and he was 54, and he had been Magnus's closest operational lieutenant for 20 years. And there was nothing in what Kael told her or what she found independently that indicated any daylight between Tamaki's interests and Magnus's. He was loyal the way load-bearing structures are loyal, not from choice or fear, but from fundamental function. Tamaki is the problem, she said to Kael on the 5th day. I know. You can't move the other two without moving him first. He reads the room. If he's watching Funo and Chasen and they're moving, he'll signal Magnus before you've finished a sentence. I know, he said again. So how do we neutralize him? Kael was quiet for a long moment. He was sitting across from her at the dining table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, which she'd noticed was what happened when he was thinking in a way that consumed his attention fully. I don't know, he said finally, and the honesty of it was almost startling. Then that's what we spend the next 2 weeks figuring out, she said. She figured it out on day 11, and the answer came from the most unexpected direction, Marcus. She'd been on the phone with her brother. A normal call, ordinary brother-sister conversation, him telling her about a student who had made him laugh, her deflecting questions about Tokyo with enough warmth that he didn't push, and he'd asked her how her dissertation research was going, and she'd said it was complicated, and he'd said in the way he always did, casually, without knowing he was saying anything important. You always figure out the people who think they can't be figured out. That's your thing. After she hung up, she sat with that for a long time. She went back through everything she had on Tamaki, and she looked at it differently. Not for the crack in the loyalty, because there wasn't one. Not for the exit motivation, because there wasn't one of those either. But for the thing underneath both. The thing that drove a man to choose 20 years of absolute fealty to a structure that he had to know was not permanent. She found it in a peripheral note from something Kael had mentioned in passing about the organizational history. Tamaki had a son, 19. At university in Hokkaido, studying architecture, completely removed from his father's world by apparent mutual agreement. And Magnus had, 3 years ago, in the context of a conversation Kael had witnessed, made a reference to the son that had caused Tamaki to go so still he hadn't appeared to breathe for a full 30 seconds. Not a threat. Not even close to a threat. A reference. The lightest possible touch on a pressure point. So light that it could be denied. So light that responding to it would have looked like overreaction. But Tamaki had remembered it. Kael was certain he remembered it. And a man who remembered a light touch on a pressure point for 3 years was a man who spent time imagining what a heavier touch would feel like. He's not loyal because he wants to be, she said to Kael. He's loyal because the alternative puts his son at risk, and he doesn't trust that his own neutrality is enough to protect the kid. He thinks being inside is safer than being outside. Kael looked at her. How do we change that calculus? We show him that inside is no longer the safe position, she said. Specifically, we show him that Magnus's decline is not preventable and that the people who go down with him go down fully. And we show him there's a structure after Magnus that he can trust to leave his son alone. She held Kael's gaze. That means he has to trust you. He doesn't. Not yet, she said. Getting Tamaki alone before the gathering was the piece that required Kael's part of the operation. A manufactured situation. A 10-minute window at a pre-gathering reception the week before the main event, where Kael could put her in proximity to Tamaki without it appearing engineered. She spent 3 days preparing for 10 minutes. The reception was at a private club in Minato. She wore something that said less than her previous appearance and moved through the room with the careful social calibration of someone who has done years of fieldwork in high-pressure human environments, which she had. She found Tamaki near the edge of the room with a drink he'd barely touched, and she spent the first 4 minutes of their conversation doing nothing except being a person rather than a presence. Genuine questions, genuine listening, the specific warmth of someone who is actually interested in the answers. On the 5th minute, she said, "Your son is studying architecture." The stillness. The same stillness Kael had described. A microsecond, then controlled response. Yes. There's a program in Hokkaido that's doing interesting work in structural integration. I came across it in research context. She said it with the casual specificity of someone mentioning something they'd thought of on the way over. The kind of program that benefits from being outside the noise of cities, from a certain kind of insulation. Tamaki looked at her. His eyes were dark and very still, and she held them without flinching, because flinching now would collapse everything. That's a specific thing to mention, he said. It's a specific kind of program, she said. The best work tends to happen in stable environments, away from volatility. A pause. I imagine that matters to people whose work they care about. She let that be everything she said. She moved away 2 minutes later, naturally, the conversation concluding without a sharp edge, without any surface that could be pointed to as a pressure or a pitch. In the car afterward, Kael said, "Well, I don't know," she said, "but I gave him something to sit with. Is that enough?" "It has to be," she said. Mad. The night of the gathering arrived with the specific quality of nights that have been approached rather than surprised by. Rain. Again. The same Arden property outside the city, but transformed by the occasion. More cars in the drive, more security visible at the perimeter, light in every window. The gathering was annual, and it had a ceremonial function beneath its operational one, a demonstration of continuity, of Magnus's ongoing centrality, of the organization's health and permanence. It was the kind of event where the symbolism was the point, which was exactly why it was the right place for the symbolism to break. She and Kael arrived together. She had spent 40 minutes in the car not preparing because all the preparation was done, and spending those 40 minutes on it would be diminishing returns. Instead, she sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the rain and listened to Kael's breathing, and thought about how strange it was to sit beside a person and know their breathing patterns the way you know the layout of a room you've lived in, automatically, without trying, because the information had simply become part of your environment. "When this is over," she said, not looking at him. "Yes." "I don't know what happens after that." "Neither do I. That used to bother me more than it does right now." He was quiet for a moment. "That might be dissociation." "Probably," she agreed. "I'll examine it later." He made a sound that under different circumstances would have been a laugh. The car stopped. Rio opened the door. The rain had reduced to a fine cold mist that hit her face when she stepped out, and she took one full breath of it, cold and damp and real, the outside world existing independently of everything inside the building in front of her. And then she went in. The gathering had 41 people in the main room by the time it reached full attendance. She knew, through Kael's briefing, the names and positions of 33 of them. The 8 she didn't know were staffers and security, and she cataloged them in the first 20 minutes by behavior and positioning. The room was the same room she'd been in 6 weeks ago for the family dinner, but arranged differently, less intimate, more formal. The long table replaced by a configuration of smaller groupings that facilitated movement and conversation rather than fixed hierarchy. Magnus was present from the start, and he was different tonight. Still the geological authority, still the measured economy of a man who didn't waste action. But there was something in the way he moved through the room that she had not seen at the dinner. A quality of surveillance that went beyond his normal assessment, a slight edge in the attention he was paying to the space around him. He knew something was different. She didn't know what he knew, but the instinct for threat was operating at higher intensity than his resting state. She noted that and kept moving. Funo was near the eastern side of the room with 2 men she identified as affiliates from the Osaka connection. She had 30 minutes before the formal dinner portion began, which was the window. She found Chasen first, easier, because Chasen's red had been the simplest of the 3, the man already looking for an exit and needing only confirmation that the exit led somewhere stable, rather than to a worse situation. She spent 8 minutes with Chasen. She didn't pitch anything. She asked him about the financial architecture of a project she knew from Kael's briefing he'd been developing independently, a legitimate real estate development in Kanagawa that had no organizational entanglement, that was purely his own. And she asked about it with enough specific knowledge to signal that she understood the difference between that project and his other work. And she asked with enough genuine interest to signal that the difference was the point. She watched him understand what she was saying without her saying it. "That project sounds promising," she said finally. "It has good bones," he said carefully. "Stability matters in construction," she said, "and in everything else." A pause. Kael believes in that project, as a model. She moved away, clean. She had 6 minutes left before the dinner bell. Funo was harder because Funo was being watched. Not by Magnus directly. He was across the room in conversation, but by a man positioned near the wall whose posture had the specific quality of someone doing deliberate environmental monitoring. She identified him as one of Magnus's direct security, which meant Magnus had Funo under active observation, which meant Magnus already had some sense of the fault line. She changed the approach. Instead of Funo, she moved to a position that put her in the same conversational cluster, adjacent rather than direct, and she waited for the natural moment of the cluster's reorganization that would bring her within Funo's conversational radius. When it came, she didn't speak to him specifically. She addressed the cluster, a comment about one of the legitimate business matters that had been mentioned, and she made the comment in a way that demonstrated she knew the organizational history of that business in enough depth to be read by someone paying attention, as someone who understood exactly how that history had been shaped and by whom. Funo looked at her. Once. Quickly. She met it and let it pass without expression. It was enough. She didn't need him to move tonight. She needed him to hesitate. A hesitation was a crack, and a crack in a room under the right pressure. The dinner bell rang. She found Kael's side as the room reorganized toward the table. He bent his head slightly, not close enough to be conspicuous, and she said very quietly, "Chasen is ready. Funo is in. But Magnus has eyes on Funo, which means he's already sensing something." She felt Kael's arm under her hand go briefly rigid. "How long before he moves?" "Tonight," she said. "If something triggers him. He's operating on instinct, and instinct doesn't hold for long once it fires." "Then we move first." Yes, 41 people sat down to dinner. It happened in the fourth course. She was watching Magnus and had been watching Magnus with the peripheral attention she'd trained for clinical observation, present in the table conversation, apparently relaxed, but with a portion of her processing continuously on him, tracking the micro-movements of a man whose instincts were very good and who was close to acting on them. She saw him look at Tamaki, and she saw Tamaki look back. It was not a look between allies checking in. It was a look between two people in a structure that is about to produce a decision, where one is clarifying whether the other is in or out of what comes next. Magnus was asking Tamaki something without words, and Tamaki's gaze moved, very slightly, toward Kael. Not hostile, not allied, just different from what it had been at any previous point in the evening, a quality of assessment rather than automatic loyalty. Magnus noticed. She saw the moment he noticed. The almost imperceptible compression of something in his expression, the adjustment of a man recalibrating based on new data, and she thought, "It's happening now. There is no more preparation. There is only this." She reached under the table and found Kael's hand and pressed once, firm, the signal they'd agreed on. His hand closed around hers for exactly 1 second. Then he stood. The table went quiet, with the specific quality of a room that has been waiting for the thing that just happened. Kael stood at his place with the gathered attention of 40 people and Magnus at the far end of the table, and he said in Japanese, she followed enough to catch the structure, something about the organization, something about change, something that used the word future 3 times in a way she recognized from his briefing notes as the specific framing he'd prepared for the formal declaration of the internal challenge. Magnus's face was completely still. Then Magnus said one word. She didn't catch it, but she caught what came after. The guard near the wall moved, and 2 others near the room's entrance moved, and the specific quality of the air in the room became the quality of a room in which violence is no longer hypothetical. Kael did not sit down. She had not sat down either. She was on her feet without remembering standing, years of clinical training overridden by the specific animal knowledge that she needed to be vertical for whatever happened in the next 90 seconds. Funo stood, not toward Magnus. He simply stood, and the act of him standing, of his position being declared by nothing more than the verticality of his body, landed on the room like a weight. Chasen did not stand, but he placed his hands flat on the table in the gesture Kael had described to her as the traditional posture of abstention from organizational conflict. Neither side, which in this context meant he was not supporting Magnus's response, which was most of what Kael needed from him. Magnus looked at his table and saw the arithmetic of it, and the expression that moved across his face was not anger. It was something colder and more functional than anger. A man running calculations at speed on a position that had just changed. Kael, Magnus said. His voice was level. It was the level of something very dangerous that hasn't decided to move yet. Father, Kael said, you have one chance to sit down. No, Kael said. I don't. Magnus looked at the guard near the wall. She was already moving before the guard did, not because she could stop a guard. She had no illusions about her physical capabilities in this room, but because she had one thing to do and approximately 4 seconds to do it, and she did it from the standing position that put her in the center of the table's sightline, in the visual center of 41 people. She spoke in Japanese. Her Japanese was imperfect, and she knew it, and she used the imperfection deliberately because a woman speaking a language she hadn't fully mastered in a room full of men who owned rooms like this one was not a person performing power. She was a person who had something to say that was more important than how she said it. She told them what she was, not who. What? A psychologist who studied coercive systems, a researcher who had spent 4 years documenting how structures built on fear sustained themselves and how they collapsed. A person who understood, clinically and personally, the specific mechanism by which a man in Magnus Arden's position maintained power. Not through the loyalty of people who loved him, but through the manufactured dependency of people who believed they had no other option. She did not tell them what to do. She told them what she saw. About Funo's 30 years of managed debt. About the protection of things they loved being made contingent on compliance. About the specific psychology of a man who needed to own the people around him rather than earn them, who turned love into a weapon because genuine attachment frightened him. She talked for 4 minutes. She could feel her voice wanting to shake, and she kept it from shaking through the specific technique her dissertation advisor had taught her for high-stakes presentations. Drop the register, slow the breath, let the voice find its floor rather than its ceiling. By the 3rd minute, the guard had stopped moving. By the 4th minute, the room was absolutely silent. Magnus looked at her with the flat, cold attention of someone who is deciding something at the most fundamental level. Not operational, not organizational, personal. Who are you? He said. Not the question itself. He knew who she was. The register of a man looking at something he had underestimated and knowing it. I'm his wife, she said. And I'm the person who just told 40 people in this room something they already knew and didn't have a framework to act on. You don't know what you've done, Magnus said. I know exactly what I've done, she said. The silence stretched. Outside, the rain had resumed, audible now in the room's stillness, the soft, relentless percussion of it against glass and stone. Then Tamaki stood up. He didn't look at Magnus. He didn't look at Kael. He looked at the table in front of him for a moment with the expression of a man resolving something that has been a weight for longer than anyone in the room knew. Then he straightened. Enough, Tamaki said. One word, in the specific register of a man whose one word carried 30 years of operational authority. The guard near the wall stopped entirely. Magnus looked at Tamaki with the expression of someone watching a structure they built with their own hands, deciding to stand differently. The cold calculation on his face went through a sequence she could read from 20 feet away. Threat assessment, loyalty reassessment, the rapid restructuring of a position that had changed at its foundation. He looked at Kael. Something passed between them that she couldn't fully read. The specific transmission between a father and a son in a moment where all the roles they'd occupied for 30 years were breaking down into something older and more permanent and more painful than any organizational structure. Kael held it. He held it without flinching, without the management she was used to, with the raw and terrible openness of someone who has stopped pretending that the thing they needed to say could be said more carefully. Step down, Kael said, or I give everything I have to the people who will take everything you have. Your choice. Magnus's jaw moved once. The room held its breath. Then the door at the far end of the room opened, and Celine Voss walked in with 4 men she didn't recognize. And the quality of their entrance, the specific physical authority of people who are not guests, who have not been invited, who have arrived for a reason that supersedes invitation, changed the room's architecture entirely. Celine crossed the floor and stopped 8 feet from Magnus with the calm of someone who had been waiting 22 years for this specific moment and had decided, somewhere in the approach, that there was nothing left to perform. She reached into her jacket and placed something on the table between herself and Magnus. A drive, small, unremarkable, the kind that contains the kind of documentation that does not need to announce itself. 47 accounts, Celine said. 23 countries, 18 years of records your attorneys told you were inaccessible. She looked at him. I've been patient, Magnus. You should understand that. Magnus stared at the drive. Kael stared at Celine. Nyla stood at the center of the table with her heart hitting her ribs so hard she could feel it in her jaw, and she watched the moment pivot on its axis, the entire engineered structure of the evening clicking into its final configuration in a way that was both exactly what she'd worked toward and completely different from how she'd imagined it would feel. Because standing here, in this room, with 41 people at the end of what had just happened, she understood that she had not been executing a plan. She had been changing. The woman who had sat on the floor of her apartment 7 minutes into grief and made a controlled list of options was not the same person who had just spoken 4 minutes of difficult truth into a room full of dangerous men without a single note to refer to, without a framework built in advance from the raw interior of everything she had understood and experienced and survived in the past 3 months. She was not the same person. The question that hit her in that moment, quiet under the noise of everything happening around her, was what that meant for what came next, for the choices waiting on the other side of tonight, for the specific and unresolved truth about a man across the table who had done an unforgivable thing and had also, in the specific and unresolvable way of real people rather than case studies, been, the room didn't explode. That was the first thing she registered in the seconds after Celine set the drive on the table. The absence of the violence she'd been bracing for, the specific animal readiness she'd been carrying in her chest since the guards moved, the adrenaline that had nowhere to go now because the room had gone so still it had its own weight. Magnus looked at the drive. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he built with his hands that has just turned against him. Not surprised, because men like Magnus Arden had excised surprise from their operational vocabulary decades ago, but with the specific recognition of a reckoning that had been structural rather than unexpected. Something in the architecture of what he'd built had always carried this possibility. He had known it, he had managed against it for 30 years, and the management had run out. He looked up from the drive to Celine. 22 years, he said. Yes, she said. And you chose tonight. I chose when it was ready. She said it without heat, without the triumphalism that the moment might have earned. Just the flat factual delivery of someone who had spent 2 decades doing something very difficult with very little margin for error and was not going to perform anything about the completion of it. The documentation alone isn't enough without the room. You know that. The room required Kael, and Kael required... She glanced briefly at Nyla. What he required. Magnus followed the glance. He looked at Nyla for a long moment. The assessment she'd felt at the dinner 6 weeks ago was present again, but recalibrated. She had changed in his estimation, and she could feel the change like a physical temperature shift, the specific cold of being recognized as a threat by a person who responds to threats from a particular register. You coached her, Magnus said to Kael. Not a question. No, Kael said. Magnus's jaw moved. You expect me to believe... She's been working on her own since the day she arrived, Kael said. I gave her access and context. She did the rest. He paused, and she heard something in the pause that she'd heard once or twice before and was still learning how to name, a particular quality of candor that came from someone who had spent most of their life managing their own admissions very carefully and was choosing, in this moment, not to. I underestimated her in every direction. I'd like to point out that this represents significant personal growth. Someone at the table, she thought it was Chasen, made a sound that was almost involuntary, the suppressed exhale of someone trying very hard not to acknowledge something almost absurd in the middle of something very serious. Magnus did not make that sound. Magnus stood up. He stood the way he'd sat, with the specific gravity of a man whose body had spent 67 years expecting to occupy the center of whatever room he was in. He straightened his jacket. He picked up the drive from the table and held it for a moment, looking at it, and then he set it back down. What are the terms? He said. Kael told him. Clean, specific, without embellishment. The framework he and Nyla had built over 18 days. The structure that would take Magnus out of operational authority over everything. The legal transfer of control. The guarantees for people in the organization whose futures needed clarity. The terms of Magnus's own exit from the country. Not prison. Kael had made that choice, and Nyla had not argued with it, because she understood the calculation, even if she didn't entirely reconcile herself to it. Exile. Managed, permanent, documented enough that attempting to return would trigger consequences that the documents on the drive would survive. Magnus listened to all of it with the stillness of a man running every available countermove against the situation and finding them progressively less viable than the last. She watched him do it. The working of the jaw, the slight movements of his hands at his sides that she had learned over one dinner and one high-stakes evening were his tell. The physical manifestation of an interior process that every other part of him had learned to conceal. When Kael finished, Magnus was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Nyla again. "You understand what you've married into," he said. "I'm beginning to," she said. "He's not an easy thing to survive." "Neither am I," she said. Something moved across Magnus's face that she had no clean word for. Not respect exactly, not softness. Something older and more complicated. The recognition, maybe, of a person with a specific quality. The same quality he'd spent decades trying to install in the people around him through force, rather than finding it already present. The irony of finding it in the woman his son had acquired through a mechanism Magnus himself would have designed. He said nothing else to her. He turned to Kael, and what passed between them in that look was private in a way she didn't try to read. Father and son at the end of something, the specific register of damage done between people who shared blood and history, and 30 years of a particular kind of violence done to each other's understanding of love. "I need 1 hour," Magnus said, "to make calls." "You have 30 minutes, Kael said. "Rio will be with you." Magnus looked at Rio. Rio looked back with the neutral professionalism of someone who had been waiting for this specific instruction longer than he'd been comfortable with. Magnus nodded once and walked toward the side room, and the guards near the door, his guards, who had been watching the room shift around them for the past 20 minutes, stepped aside. The door closed. 41 people let out a collective breath that was almost audible. The hour that followed was the most disorienting of Nyla's life, which was a significant claim given the competition. The formal dinner had not resumed. People moved in clusters, the room reorganizing itself around the new reality, with the specific efficiency of people who were very accustomed to situations changing and who had learned that standing still when things changed was more dangerous than moving. She watched Funo have a brief, low conversation with one of his Osaka associates. She watched Chasen take out his phone and make a call he stepped away from the room to complete. She watched the 3 men she'd been studying for 18 days begin the process of accommodating themselves to a different arrangement, and she understood that this was how power actually transitioned, not in the dramatic moment of declaration, but in the 30 minutes afterward when people started making phone calls and deciding which version of the future they were going to be standing in. Celine found her near the window. "You should know," Celine said without preamble, "that I've been building what you just saw for longer than Kael has been aware of it. His restructuring helped. He provided the internal architecture I needed, but the documentation, the 47 accounts, that predates his involvement by 12 years. Nyla looked at her. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're going to have questions about who can be trusted and what comes next. And the answer to that question is partial and specific, and I want you to have the accurate version rather than an assumption." Celine looked out at the room. "I can be trusted on everything that relates to removing Magnus and stabilizing the transition. What happens after that is a different question with a different answer." "That's a very honest caveat." "I'm only honest when dishonesty would be inefficient," Celine said. "At this point, dishonesty would be inefficient." "What do you want from after?" Celine was quiet for a moment. "To stop," she said simply. "To be finished with this particular chapter of my life. To live somewhere that is not structured around the management of a man I have despised for 22 years. She glanced at Nyla sideways. "I'm 63. I have things I haven't done yet. I'd like to do them while the relevant faculties are still operational." It was the most human thing she'd said in any of their 3 conversations, and Nyla recognized it as probably the most accurate portrait of Celine she was going to get. "Thank you," Nyla said, "for what you did tonight." "Thank yourself," Celine said. "I had a drive full of documents. You had a room full of people, and you did something I haven't seen done in that room in 22 years. You made them feel something other than fear." She picked up her untouched drink from the window ledge and finally took a sip. "That's not a small thing." Magnus left the property at 11:40 at night in a car that did not return. She stood at the window and watched the headlights go and felt, not triumph. That was the thing she'd been braced for, and that didn't come. What she felt instead was the specific exhaustion that lives underneath adrenaline once the adrenaline releases, and underneath that a kind of hollow quiet. The particular silence of a space where something very large used to be and is no longer. Kael came to stand beside her. They stood without speaking for a while, watching the drive empty as the other cars followed Magnus's. The organizational reshuffling happening in real time, people repositioning themselves in the new geography. "Tamaki," she said. "He'll stay," Kael said, "on different terms. He knows the landscape. He'll be useful, and he knows his position is different now. You need to follow up with him separately, not organizationally. The architecture program. He needs to know that's protected as a genuine commitment, not as a negotiating position." "I know. I'm not saying it because I think you'll forget. I'm saying it because it matters more than the organizational piece." He looked at her. "I know," he said again, and this time the repetition carried something different. The weight of a man who had spent 18 days watching her work and was recalibrating continuously what he thought he understood about the specific way she operated. She turned from the window. The room behind them was mostly empty now, staff beginning the quiet restoration of the space to its ordinary state. The table that had held 41 people through the most significant things she'd done in her professional and personal life was already being cleared. "I need to sleep," she said. "Yes." "We have about 1,000 things to handle starting tomorrow." "Yes." "And I need to call Marcus." Kael nodded. "Of course." She started toward the door and then stopped because there was something that needed to be said here rather than later, and she had learned in the past 3 months that later had a way of becoming a position rather than a postponement. She turned. "The file," she said. He waited. "I understand why you made the decisions you made. The operational logic is, I can follow it. I can hold it in my head as a logical structure." She looked at him steadily. "That's not the same as it being okay. I want to be specific about that. Not as an accusation anymore, just as a fact that exists between us." "I know," he said. "And I want you to know that I also understand that every time I've watched you make a decision since I found that file, you've made it differently than you made the one that brought me here." A pause. "That's also a fact that exists between us. I'm putting both of them on the table because I think you need to see them together rather than one at a time." He was very still, the way he went still when something landed at a level below his management systems. "Nyla." "Don't apologize again," she said. Not harshly. "Just carry it accurately. That's all I'm asking." He nodded. She went to bed. Bob. The legal architecture of the transition took 11 weeks. Kael had people who handled the specifics, layers of attorneys and organizational process that moved with the speed of things that had been prepared in advance. She was not involved in most of it. Her role had been the room, the specific human calculus of that night. And the aftermath of that was not documentation or financial restructuring, but the ongoing daily work of a situation that was now different from what it had been. She finished her dissertation in those 11 weeks. She wrote the final chapters in the Eastern Room in the mornings, the same desk with the same view, and she was aware, could not have avoided being aware, that the research she'd spent 4 years building had been tested and complicated and deepened in ways she hadn't planned by the past 4 months. She did not write about it directly. The research maintained its academic remove, the appropriate distance of a researcher from her material, but she felt it in the specific weight of certain paragraphs, the way some sentences about coercive systems and the people who survived them carried something that hadn't been in earlier drafts. Her committee accepted it with minor revisions. She called Dr. Okonkwo after the defense to tell her, and Dr. Okonkwo said, I want to hear everything, but I can tell that's going to require time and something stronger than tea. And Nyla laughed in a way that felt like something releasing that she hadn't known she'd been holding. I'm all right, Nyla said. I know you are, Dr. Okonkwo said. You've always been all right. You've also always been more than all right, which is a different statement, and which is what I'm actually saying. Marcus came to Tokyo in December. She met him at Narita in the early afternoon, watched him come through arrivals with his bag over one shoulder and the specific loose-limbed walk that had been his since he was 14 and had not changed despite everything. And she felt the particular physical relief of a body that has been running on contingency power returning to its normal grid. He hugged her with the same force as outside the detention facility. She let it last longer this time. In the taxi into the city, he looked out at Tokyo with the wide-eyed engagement of someone for whom the place had been first a trauma and was now, he'd told her on the phone, something he wanted to reclaim on his own terms. He asked questions about the neighborhoods. He pointed at things. He was himself, entirely and unmistakably, and the fact of his unreduced selfhood was something she felt in her chest as a pressure that was not quite pain. She had not told him the full truth. She had told him a version, that her marriage had been a complicated arrangement that was in the process of becoming a complicated reality, that the man he was going to meet was not simple, and their relationship was not simple, and that she was handling it. Marcus, who knew her better than almost anyone, had listened to all of this and then said, "Are you safe?" "Yes," she said. Actually, not managing it, safe. Actually safe. "Yes," she said again. He'd been quiet for a moment. "Do you want me to come?" She told him yes. Kael met them at the apartment with the specific careful dignity of a man who understands that he is being evaluated on a register that has nothing to do with organizational authority and who is choosing to be evaluated honestly rather than performatively. He shook Marcus's hand and said it was good to meet him and meant it. And Marcus, who was 23 and perceptive beyond his years, looked at Kael for a moment with the assessing gaze of a younger brother who has specific concerns about his older sister, and then said, "She doesn't need me to look out for her. I just want to make sure you know that." "I know that," Kael said. "Good," Marcus said, and then looked around the apartment and said, "Okay, this is genuinely insane. Can I see the view?" And the tension went out of the room like a door opening. She had the conversation she'd been not quite having with herself on a Tuesday in January. She was at the dining table with her revised dissertation and a cold cup of coffee when Kael came in from a meeting looking like someone who had spent the morning in a room full of organizational transition problems and was carrying the residue of that. And he stopped in the kitchen to make fresh coffee without being asked, which was something he did now, had been doing for weeks. The specific unprompted attentiveness of someone learning the difference between managing a person and simply being present with them. He set a fresh cup in front of her without comment and went back to the kitchen to pour his own. She looked at the cup. She thought about the scoring matrix, the circled phrase, the cold engineering of an approach that had found her at her lowest and used her most vulnerable point as a mechanism. She held that, let it have its full weight, did not minimize it or explain it away. And then she thought about 18 days of preparation in which he had given her everything she asked for. About the car ride home from the Arden property, the 40 minutes of complete truth, the absence of any management in his voice. About twice-monthly therapy and the annotated books, and the person she'd found standing at the window in the dark at 3 a.m, carrying something he'd never asked her to carry with him. About the way he'd said I underestimated her in every direction in front of 41 people in a room where power was the only currency. And the way he'd said it without calculation. The words arriving before the tactical assessment of whether saying them was useful. She thought about the fact that she was still here, past the 12 months she'd signed for, past the external threat that had required her to stay, past any structure that required anything of her at all. She was still here because she had chosen to be. She had not made the choice all at once. It had happened the way most significant interior changes happen. Incrementally in small accretions, in the accumulation of moments that were individually unremarkable and collectively decisive. And she had been resisting acknowledging it because acknowledging it required her to hold two things simultaneously: the damage and the choice, the wrong that had been done to her, and the person who had done it and who was also, in the specific and unresolvable way of actual human beings rather than clinical case studies, someone she had come to know. Kael came back to the table and sat across from her with his coffee, and looked at the dissertation pages and said nothing, and she looked at him, and he looked at her. "I'm not forgiving the file," she said. He nodded. "I'm not. This isn't the part where I tell you it's okay. It's not okay. It's something I've processed and integrated and chosen to continue past, but those are not the same thing as okay. I know, but I'm going to need you to understand something." She held his gaze. "I've been deciding whether to stay not because of the contract or because of what's still being sorted legally or because of my brother. I've been deciding because I wanted to know if I was choosing out of damage or out of clarity." A pause. "It's clarity." He was very still. "That doesn't mean I know what this is," she continued, "or what it becomes, or whether I can fully trust you, because trust is something that gets rebuilt and not announced, and we're early in the rebuilding." She looked at her coffee. "But I'm in it. Whatever it is. I'm in it with my eyes open and without a contract telling me to be." He didn't say anything for a moment. Outside, January Tokyo moved through its morning with the dense, gray sky energy of a city in winter, buses and commerce, and ordinary human life conducting itself in every direction. She could hear it faintly through the glass. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "The therapy." He looked at his hands around the cup. "I started it after the second relationship, after she went to the clinic. I started it because I needed to understand what I was, what I did, whether it could be different." He was quiet for a moment. "And I spent 14 months doing that work. And at the end of it, I thought I understood myself well enough to do this, to construct something that would give me what I needed without consuming someone." He lifted his eyes. "I was wrong about that in specific ways. What I understood in therapy was my capacity for damage. What I didn't understand was that building the candidate assessment and the leverage mechanism was the damage in a different shape, that the problem wasn't the violence, it was the control, and I just found a more sophisticated form of it." She listened. "I understood that when you found the file," he said. "The expression on your face, you didn't show me much of it, but what I saw was enough. And I understood that I had done the same thing I'd always done. Identified what I needed, identified the mechanism that would secure it, and executed. As if you were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be actually known." "Yes," she said. "I'm not telling you this because it changes what happened. I'm telling you because you told me to carry it accurately, and this is what accurately looks like." He set down the cup. "I'm trying to become someone who treats the people they love as people rather than things to be managed. I have made significant progress on that project, and I have a very long way to go. Both of those statements are true." She looked at him for a long moment. The January light came through the windows at the flat angle of winter, and in it he looked like what he actually was. A person in his early 30s with dark circles and a controlled way of inhabiting his body, and a mind she had spent months learning the edges of. Someone genuinely difficult and genuinely trying, the two things coexisting in the specific uncomfortable way that real people coexisted with their own complexity. "I know," she said, and then she reached across the table and put her hand over his, and they sat like that for a while, in the particular quiet of two people who have been through something that has no clean name, who have hurt each other and been hurt by each other and by forces larger than either of them, and who have arrived at a place that isn't resolution exactly, but is something real, something built from the actual material of who they were, rather than the version of themselves they'd been trying to present. 6 months later, she published her dissertation. The work had been refined and expanded in its final form, accepted by a journal that mattered to her, the kind of acceptance that arrives as a confirmation rather than a surprise, but is still surprising when it happens. She read the published version 3 times over 2 days, looking at her own words with the specific estrangement of recognizing the version of herself that had written them, not the person she'd been when she started the research, not entirely the person she was now, some previous self preserved in the clarity of the argument and the weight of the evidence. The research had been cited twice before the end of the month. That was its own kind of strange. The idea that words she'd written were now in rooms she'd never be in, doing work she'd never observe, touching people she'd never know. She called Dr. Okonkwo to tell her. "And you?" Dr. Okonkwo said after the professional acknowledgments. Not the research. You. Nyla looked out the window at Tokyo in summer. The city was different in this season. The particular humid aliveness of it, the green appearing in the small pockets of park space between the buildings, the quality of the light in the late afternoon that made everything look briefly as if it had been considered and placed rather than accumulated. Still figuring it out, she said. That's the correct answer, Dr. Okonkwo said. That's the only honest answer at any age. Anyone who says otherwise is selling something. She was on the terrace of the apartment. She had one now, the small amendment to the space she'd been most deliberate about. The place where she grew herbs in ceramic pots that did better than the ones in her old apartment had, fed by the summer light. When Kael found her at the end of a day that had been full of the ongoing practical work of a life that was still in the process of becoming whatever it was becoming. He had been in meetings all day. She had been in a call with a researcher in Toronto who wanted to collaborate on a follow-up study. They had lived their separate days and were now in the same space in the way that people with individual, functioning lives came back to a shared space. Not for completion, but for the particular kind of companionship that comes from choosing the same place to be at the end of the day. He stood beside her at the railing and looked out at the city. The evening light was doing its late summer thing with the skyline, the specific quality that happens in the gap between sundown and full dark, when the neon begins to matter, and the sky above it holds on to a deep, fading blue that existed nowhere else in her experience the way it existed in Tokyo. Tamaki's son presented his first project, Kael said. I had someone send a note. Good. He's designing a community center in Sapporo. The structural brief involves... He stopped. She found some way to make it work where the load distribution uses the natural topography rather than working against it. Apparently the engineering faculty is using it as a teaching example. That's genuinely impressive. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. I think Tamaki cried when I told him. She looked at him. He didn't let me see it, Kael said, but I could tell. She thought about the circled phrase, the leverage window, the specific cold of reading those words. She thought about the fact that the same man who had written that note had also, 6 months later, sent a message about a young architect's first project to her father, because it mattered, and because it was the right thing to do, and because he was working, slowly and imperfectly, toward being a person for whom those two reasons were the same reason. She did not forgive the file. She held that cleanly and would hold it cleanly, because forgetting the shape of damage was how you failed to recognize it in the future. And she was a person who paid attention to damage with the specific committed clarity of a researcher who had decided that understanding it was the most useful thing she could offer the world. But she was also standing on this terrace, in this city, in this life, and she had chosen every part of it. You asked me once, she said, what I wanted, early on, before the contract. You asked what a life that makes sense looked like. You said it was an evasion. It was, she said. I didn't know the answer then. She leaned slightly on the railing, looking out. I think it looks like this. Not specifically, not this terrace, this view, whatever category we're in, but the actual one. The one you build from real material, where you know what's in it, where you're not performing the shape of a life for someone's benefit. He was quiet, and she felt him listening with the specific quality of attention she had learned was what he looked like when he wasn't managing anything, when he was simply present. Even with everything in it, she said. Including the file, he said. Including the file, she agreed. It's all in there. That's what real is. He turned to look at her. The neon had begun below them, the city's nighttime self arriving with its particular electric beauty, and in that light he looked like the version of him she had the most accurate picture of. The insomniac, and the annotated books, and the twice-monthly therapy, and the man who had done an unforgivable thing and was choosing, every day, to be accountable to it rather than past it. She looked back at him. He raised his hand and touched her face with a carefulness that she had come to recognize as specific and deliberate, not the studied restraint of someone managing an impulse, but the genuine care of someone who had learned that the lightness of a touch was not a diminishment of what it meant, but an expression of it. He touched her face the way you touch something you are not trying to possess, the way you touch something you understand you are only ever permitted to be near, never to own. Can I? He said. Yes, she said. He pressed his forehead to hers, and they stood like that for a moment above the city, both of them breathing, both of them present, in the specific and uncategorizable space that existed between the people they had been when they started and the people they were now, not arrived, not finished, not resolved into anything clean or simple, but real in the particular and difficult and irreplaceable way of things that have been tested by actual conditions and remained. Below them, Tokyo moved through its evening. It did not care what had happened in the rooms above it, what contracts had been signed or broken or transcended, what damage had been done or what work was being done to answer it. The city was itself, entirely, in every direction. The vast and indifferent hum of 10 million lives that had nothing to do with this terrace and these two people and the specific, complicated, real thing they were building in the space between what they had each survived. She closed her eyes. She thought about Marcus, who was teaching again, who had not been told everything and did not need to be, who was at home in Chicago eating something she'd taught him to make, and probably calling her tomorrow and living his whole unmarked life without knowing the full cost of its continuance. She held that fact and felt it cleanly, the love and the weight of it and the satisfaction that it was there to feel. She thought about the dissertation on the desk inside, the published work that had already begun to move through the world without her, carrying its argument into rooms she'd never see. She thought about the woman she'd been in the cab to Akubo Tower that first night, cataloging exit strategies, bracing against the possibility of being used, choosing anyway because the alternative was watching someone she loved disappear, and she was not built for that particular inaction. That woman had been right about almost everything she'd feared. The mechanisms had been real. The engineering had been exactly as deliberate as she'd suspected. The damage had been exactly as specific as the worst version of her read had predicted. And she was here, intact, rebuilt in a shape she hadn't been able to imagine from that cab, from that lobby, from that elevator rising toward the 41st floor. Kael's forehead was warm against hers. His hand had moved to her shoulder, light, asking nothing. She opened her eyes. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make the coffee this time." He pulled back enough to see her face. She was looking at him with everything she was, the clarity and the wound and the choice and the research and the love that was not simple and was not uncomplicated and was not what any version of her would have designed if she'd been given the option to design it, but which was here, present, real, built from the actual material of what they had been through rather than from any version either of them had imagined standing at the beginning of it. "Okay," he said. They went inside. The terrace held the evening air and the city's sound and the empty space where two people had been standing. And after a moment, the curtain moved in the light wind that came off the water this time of year. And Tokyo continued, and the neon continued, and somewhere in Sapporo, a young architect's structural design was being discussed by people who would remember it. And somewhere in Edinburgh, a woman was teaching. And somewhere in Chicago, a young man was making a phone call. And in this apartment above this city, two damaged and specific and real human beings were making coffee and carrying everything they were and choosing, again, the difficult and irreplaceable and unresolvable thing between them. That was all. That was enough.